In the 1830s, British politicians picked up the question of reform. And so was this an era of reform? Was it a period of innovation and change? How much of this was an end or a beginning? Did it institute a long-term change in policy? Or were the Peels of the world and the Russells of the world correct, that they had done enough? Well, clearly, if you look at this Reform Act from the context of the 1830s, the vast majority of English politicians, the king, the lords, the commons, all patted themselves on the back that they had done enough, that this was the end. It was a once in a lifetime, once in a generation, once in every several hundred years change. That they had ended the reform debate. And they ended in a way that had avoided revolution. But it brings up the whole question of what people intend and what are unintentional consequences, right? The intentional consequences, they intended, right? Lord John Russell and Sir Robert Peel, Earl Grey, all believed, they all intended that this would put an end to constitutional debates. But as we've just talked about, right, the Chartists, they weren't done. Right? They saw this as a beginning, and they were going to use this as an opportunity to highlight the continued disparities in political power, how wealthy Englishmen still dominated British politics. That was certainly the position of the Chartists. It was also the position of Welsh miners. It was the position of Irish nationalists. And so for them, while it may have been intentionally the end, unintentionally, the Reform Act opened up wider and wider political participation. This whole question of reform also then brings up the case of the role of violence and leadership. How much of a role did violence play in political reform? Because comparatively speaking, right, if you look at violence in England versus violence in France, for example, the English had much less in the way of political violence. Was that because of better leadership? Did English political leaders learn from the French experience? Did they look over and say, you know, we can't just keep a lid on this? Or did they learn from their own experience, where they go back and they look at Magna Carta, where it put limitations on the monarch? Or they look back at the Tudor period, where Parliament put limitations on the Tudor monarchs and gained the power of the purse? Did they look back at the Civil War period and said, you know, if something's not done, we could end up with another violent revolt? which ends in the execution of our king? Did they look to the period of the Glorious Revolution and see that with effective leadership from peers who actually listen, that they could avoid the descent into chaos? Could you avoid violence? Because isn't that the ultimate goal of a government, is to avoid violence? So when you ask the question we had right at the beginning, was this the most advanced system? Well, it certainly had its flaws, but it did a much better job of navigating between street violence and government violence, because England, Britain did have political leaders that addressed many of the issues, certainly not all. So how much reform is necessary? Who gets to decide what reform is necessary and if it's done? Is reform evil? Is it bad to reform? Is it bad to change? Must a country stick with, quote, tradition because this is the way we've always done it? Certainly those are political outlooks, right? But it's hard not to come back to Edmund Burke, where Edmund Burke looked at the continent, looked at what's happening in France, knew English history, and said practical reform is a good thing. Because practical reform preserves what works, and practical reform reforms what's broken. In other words, both the liberal approach and the conservative approach, when properly balanced, can bring about social stability. But you've got to address the problems, got to alleviate the pain. England, Great Britain started that process in the 1830s. And it showed that it could be done. And going on through the century, then political leaders are going to look back at 1830 and say, you know, they did a little bit. Right? They made some adjustments. They relieved some pressure. And if leaders relieve a little bit of pressure along the way, adjusting systems as they go, they can avoid political violence. In other words, Edmund Burke said, practical reform provides social stability. There must be change in society. A society that does not change brings about its own destruction. Leaders identify the problems, identify the pain, and find effective solutions to remedy that. By any stretch of the imagination, the Great Reform Bill of 1832 did that. It navigated between political rigidity and bringing about practical reform.